If you were to compare Star Citizen and Everspace 2, on paper they'd seem nearly identical. They're both starfaring space epics where you pilot a ship and chart the stars. However, in practice they are very different games. Now if you're familiar with these games, you might think this isn't much of an intro. But I bring this up because it serves as a valuable case study to illustrate the challenging concept in game development: vision. When you're working on a game, your vision acts as a guiding principle shaping your gameplay experiences. There are no hard and fast rules in game development, but generally, the more cohesive your vision, the better the experience you deliver. The developers behind Star Citizen and Everspace 2 had different visions for their games, yet they both executed them exceptionally well. So what makes a good vision? One approach is to distill your vision into a set of priorities and ensure that your actions and decisions focus on those priorities, which ultimately expresses your vision. To illustrate this, I'm going to take identical features from Star Citizen and Everspace 2 and juxtapose them with one another, allowing us to see how each studio's actions reinforce the vision they were trying to deliver. But before we begin, I should mention that I'm recovering from a cold, so if my voice sounds a bit rough, that's why. Alright, let's dive in. Let's start by examining docking and undocking procedures in both games. Although they're satisfying in their own way, they focus on different aspects. In Everspace 2, you dock by simply flying towards a landing pad and pressing a button. This then triggers an immediate and snappy cutscene. The speed of the cutscene is crucial because if it lasted any longer, it would disrupt the player's flow. Undocking is similar. You just press a button and you're propelled into space. Both procedures are snappy and feature impressive visuals and sound effects, reinforcing the game's focus on quick, engaging experiences. The developers prioritize spending as little time as possible here. It all conveys a sense of forward momentum. Everspace 2 wants you spending as little time as possible doing these two procedures because there's a whole galaxy out there to explore. In contrast, Star Citizen has more complicated docking and undocking procedures. To simplify, let's just discuss undocking from the moment you enter your spaceship. First, you press a button to turn on your ship. Then you press two buttons to request the spaceport to open its blast doors. Once the request is granted, the blast doors slowly open and you carefully pilot your ship off the platform and out the doors. Finally, you push one final button to retract the landing gear and you've officially undocked. Docking is similarly intricate. You first request access to dock, receive directions from the station, carefully fly in, deploy your landing gear, and land your ship. Finally, you either shut off your ship completely or you just shut off the engines. And just to drive this point home, there's a difference between shutting off the ship entirely and only shutting down the engine, which leaves power to your core systems, lights, and shields. Clearly, Star Citizen's actions demonstrate a different set of priorities. They want you fully immersed in the grand space epic they are developing, so docking and undocking is more fleshed out, rooted in what the fantasy of piloting an epic spaceship might feel like. Okay, now that we've undocked in both games, let's talk about flight. Both games feature in-atmosphere and out-of-atmosphere flight, but with some subtle differences that ripple out in meaningful ways. Everspace 2's flight mechanics are more approachable, treating spaceflight like driving a car in any old game. You hold the accelerate button to move forward, and should you let go, your ship comes to a halt almost immediately. What's more, bumping into things in Everspace 2 isn't too bad, you suffer minor damage. The developers made flight intuitive and forgiving, which lets them prioritize combat and even lets them create some unique gameplay experiences like exploring the inside of a derelict ship or flying inside an asteroid. Star Citizen, on the other hand, simulates zero-G flight. You can pick up some incredible speeds in zero-G, and if you want to stop, you have to create a force equal to your current momentum except in the opposite direction. As you might have guessed, this takes some getting used to. And lastly, well, bumping into something in Star Citizen is not a very good idea. This simulated zero-G flight model requires you to deliberately fine-tune your movements, constantly adjusting your speed and keeping an eye out for important distance measurements. And as you can imagine, you don't do too much tight zero-G exploration in Star Citizen that puts you inside an asteroid, and that's because content like that would be very difficult to pull off. But on the flip side, Star Citizen does have some racing circuits, and its hardest one takes place in zero-G, and man, the flying people managed to achieve here is pretty impressive. Okay, so let's contrast the two flight models. Flight in Star Citizen is an activity the player constantly and actively takes part in. There's a lot to learn and hundreds of hours can be spent in just one ship before you master its controls. Meanwhile, in Everspace 2, flight is a lot more forgiving and there isn't much complexity to it. It takes a backseat to more important things like combat. Man, the difference between the two combat models is really extreme. When it comes to combat, Everspace 2 is all about the thrills, with abilities, weapons, missiles, fantastic explosions, and even ultimates that charge over time. You'll engage in fast-paced, action-packed battles that don't rely heavily on traditional dogfighting skills. The priority here is all focused on maximizing the thrills, diversity, and action. One thing that illustrates this really well is how you deal with a missile lock in Everspace 2. The developers didn't give you any traditional countermeasures to deploy. Instead, the best way to deal with a missile is to just shoot it out of the air, which is very action-focused. Star Citizen, on the other hand, indexes a lot on classical dogfighting principles, except in space. The most important part of combat in Star Citizen is actually your maneuverability and your skill as a pilot. The best way to deal with a missile lock in Star Citizen is to deploy countermeasures and evade. Counter to Everspace 2, the weapons and actual shooting takes a backseat to the player's skill as a pilot. Some ships even have an auto-targeting gimbal mode that makes shooting a lot easier, letting you focus on flying. The priority here rests squarely on the fantasy of being a skilled pilot. In fact, it isn't uncommon to see a skilled player in an inferior ship take on and destroy much larger targets. Both games have satisfying combat loops, but they go about it in different ways. One emphasizes high-octane action while the other emphasizes your skill as a pilot. Which brings us to our next point, the visuals. Star Citizen and Everspace 2 are both good-looking games, and here again they prioritize different things. Star Citizen indexes on realism while Everspace 2 goes in the opposite direction. Both games have truly breathtaking vistas and jaw-dropping visual moments, but do so in a way that matches the type of game they're making. Imagine if the art styles were reversed. If the bright colors and shapes of Everspace 2 were illustrating a game like Star Citizen, it wouldn't quite feel right, would it? Ships are another area where the two games diverge. In Star Citizen, ships are platforms with realistic stats and considerations like weight, speed, cargo capacity, and maneuverability. Two seemingly similar ships can feel fundamentally different with only a few minor stat tweaks. One example of this would be comparing the 325A ship to the Gladius. The Gladius is a far more popular fighter known for its superior maneuverability and tankiness. The 325A is a lot more versatile with its cabin and storage potential. And while its maneuverability stat isn't something to scoff at, it's still inferior to the Gladius. Now yes, you heard me right. The Gladius, the seemingly premier light fighter in Star Citizen, is better than the 325A not because it does more damage. Their firepower is actually somewhat comparable. The Gladius is better because it's a lot more nimble and maneuverable. Again, everything comes back to your skills as a pilot in Star Citizen. Everspace 2, on the other hand, has a smaller selection of ships that function more like classes in a traditional RPG. Each ship has its own distinct playstyle, from light and nimble shooters to missile boats and drone spawning vessels. The difference between these ships is a lot more striking in comparison to Star Citizen. Now let me rapid fire through some more obvious differences. When it comes to the economy and progression, both games take different approaches. Star Citizen has its priorities in its name. You're a citizen of the stars with your own career. You do different things around the verse, earn money, and fund whatever adventures you contrive. Everspace 2's progression model does include money, but it's more like a classical ARPG with its leveling and loot systems. Clearly, accessibility is another stark difference between the two, as Star Citizen is wildly more complex than Everspace 2. And that's pretty intentional, because Star Citizen sacrifices approachability in favor of the simulation, and Everspace 2 doesn't do that. And lastly, even the development process and community engagement between the two games is different. Star Citizen has built a dedicated fanbase and has fostered and grown its audience over an insanely long development cycle, while Everspace 2 went about it with more traditional means. Okay, let's summarize. Everspace 2 emphasizes docking and undocking to get you into the game as quickly as possible. They developed a responsive flight model, went heavy on the combat system, had approachable flashy visuals, ships that feel like classes, a progression model based on leveling and loot, is far more accessible, and engage its audience by somewhat traditional means. Star Citizen, on the other hand, emphasized slow, methodical docking and undocking, developed a more realistic flight model, went heavy on your piloting skills for the combat system, leaning into more traditional dogfighting models, has realistic visuals, ships that feel meaningfully different with only simple tweaks, is way less accessible than Everspace 2, and has taken a unique approach to development and community. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? We saw the actions, derived each game's priorities, and now we can clearly see how different the underlying vision for each game is. Actions dictate priorities, so when working on your own game, it is important to keep in mind a set of priorities you want to adhere to, and most important of all, make sure the actions you take are pushing your game towards those priorities. And that is how you deliver on the vision you've outlined. If you are working on your own space game, what would your priorities be? Let me know in the comments below. This channel is small enough right now where I can actually see and respond to every single comment. If you enjoyed the video today, please consider doing me a solid and leave a like and consider subscribing. Thanks again for watching everyone, I appreciate you all and I'll see you again next time.